Greetings, students. Welcome to the second part of the seventh and final module of this course. This module is titled Technology, AI, and the Future of Power in Society. So, in this part, I'm going to walk you through larger questions of ethical challenges, larger questions of inequalities, and other, social science, sociological questions that we need to reflect on when we think of AI, when we think of technology and society. So, what we are looking at on the screen is commonly known as the digital humanities stack, which is so digital humanities is an emerging area of inquiry that sits at the intersection of technology, humanities, and social sciences. And in this stack that we are looking at, if you look at the very bottom of the stack, we have, the foundation of this stack comprises computational thinking, which comprises algorithms, abstraction, decomposition, programming, and critical technical practice. And we also have knowledge representation, which is OCR, scan, databases, ontologies, design patterns, etc. So this is something that I would like you to focus on. In this part of the module, in this part of the lecture, is to bring in your sort of previous understanding of computational thinking, of knowledge representation, two questions of technology and artificial intelligence, and how that sort of affect, how that sort of inspire, how that sort of inflect questions of power geometries in any given society. So, we have looked at this, idea of computational thinking before, where we have looked at, while techne, which is one of the components of computational thinking, comprises the technical knowledge or the know-how. The idea of phronesis, on the other hand, looks at the practical wisdom of, doing computational thinking. And in that process, we bring in the question of, looking at algorithms. And while Techne would answer our question of can I write an algorithm? If yes, I can, if I have the skill set, Phronesis will bring in the question of should I be writing this algorithm at all? Because I need to be mindful of what the algorithm would function as, would function for. And that is, what we need to keep in mind, that while we design definitions of algorithm as structured sequence of steps to create an output from an input, we also need to bring into the same very definition questions of how are we conceptualizing the algorithm. And this is something, of course, Rabin in 1966 had sort of drawn our attention to when, they launched the Computers and the Humanities journal, that, and I quote, "We need never be hypnotized by the computer's capacity to count into thinking that once we have counted things, we understand them." So this, of course, opens up, large doors talking about, power relations, power geometries in the society. And we, for example, have looked at how Michel Foucault's idea of power sort of helps us, gives us a vantage point to look at, to understand, dynamics of the viewer and the viewed, in the case of images, for example, that, when you are an uncritical observer for an image versus when you are a spectating subject for an image, how is power practiced within that relationship of viewer and the viewed matters, and that sort of sets in the dynamics, the geometries, or the axis along and across which we operate. In that context, it is also helpful to for you to look at Walter Benjamin's work, titled "The Work of Art in the Age of Its Technological Reproducibility," where Walter Benjamin talks about the idea of text art and social good, and what happens when the work of art is sort of reproduced and or is reproducible. And this is what what he talks about is that when a work of art is designed for reproducibility, it makes little sense to seek for the original or the authentic work. And as soon as the criteria of authenticity ceases to be applied to artistic production, the whole social function of art is revolutionized. So art has a social function, but when this is viewed through the lens of technology, through the lens of AI. For example, in the previous lecture, we looked at Van Gogh's paintings and their immersive experiences. So when a work of art sort of changes its pattern, changes its medium of operation with the society, it also changes its relationship with the masses, because historically we have seen art, for example, have sort of contributed to an understanding of social stratification, social classes, so on. And when the technological reproducibility of artwork changes the relationship with the masses, who are designated to be consumed by a tiny elite, that sort of changes the purpose, the function of art itself. And that is a larger question that we need to keep in mind when we are talking about art, when we're talking about, in fact, any image form. Because images sort of, as we know, are packages of ideas, of values, of cultural forms, of practices. So when we look at images in digital spaces, for example, one thing that often comes to our mind is it a photoshopped image, right? So is there has been a technological interference with that image. So so it is important for us to keep in mind the inflection of technology, the inflection that AI can have on images, because that sort of oftentimes, depending on what form of image, has a direct impact on social conditions, on social questions and lifestyle. For example, a few years back, Dove, the pharmaceutical company, launched this campaign which they call the hashtag the selfie talk. And in that campaign, the selfie talk, Dove looked at questions of social media and how social media impacts self-esteem of young and adolescent children. And in this hashtag the selfie talk, Dove talks about how this is a representation of how far retouching apps can distort beauty. And they sort of launched this campaign of hashtag no digital distortion, and this is towards building self-confidence and positive body image on social media. So when we talk of technology, as you are very well aware now, talk of technology, talk of AI, and in this case, talk of images, for example, it is important to look beyond the technological question. It is important for us to look at how it is impacting, our social conditions, our lifestyle patterns, and ourselves in that regard. In fact, many years back, scholar Jean Coulborn did this study, which she titles "Killing Us Softly," and she looked at the questions of advertising's image of women and men, and particularly looking at images which have been photoshopped, which has been technologically interfered with. And when that sort of image is brought forward, as a social image, how that sort of impacts men, women, and the larger social relations is something that Jean Kilborn looks at. So you may want to look up this series. So this is a series of 4 parts, titled "Killing Us Softly." We also looked at this example of AI generated images. That came out in the Times of India about 2 years back, and how the generation of these AI generated images sort of brought in a lot of brouhaha across the country. That the artist who has produced these images have produced stereotypical images of women and men across the country, regions across the country. But to his own defense, the artist said that he's glad that this AI generated pics of stereotypes began a dialogue, because these images were produced by crowdsourced data. And when we say crowdsourced data, and the algorithm sort of picks up from the library of billions of images, which have been crowdsourced, and so it is a reflection of that crowdsourced data that sort of has been contributed by people across the country, people across who have been sort of the common people who have been contributing to the database. And that the algorithm sort of picks up the cue from that billions of images and generates these images. And so when these AI generated images are labeled as stereotypes, it is a reflection not of the AI being biased, but also of the data, the data that has been crowdsourced, and of course the people contributing to the data. That also sort of speaks to those questions. So it is important for us to understand these questions of bias, questions of stereotypes, and how they generate, or they go on generating inequalities in societies, because they are a reflection of our own positionalities. So when we talk of algorithmic bias, for example, the algorithm, we often say that the algorithm is biased, but the algorithm is biased because the data that is prompting that algorithm probably is biased, and the data is that is prompting the algorithm is biased probably because how the data was created was in a stereotypical manner. And so these are questions that have a chain effect. And it is important for us to look at just beyond constructing an algorithm and employing it as a technical know-how. Now, this is an interesting project that was conducted. That was actually conducted over several years. The title of this project is "Computer Draw a Scientist: Do AI images reject or reflect gender stereotypes?" And so, what happens, when you read this article, you will see that, the Draw a Scientist study, started in the 1960s. And this project sort of asked children at various ages to draw a scientist, and sort of, code the drawing with certain, features, such as gender. And what happens is that, you know, over the 5,000 drawings collected over the first 11 years of the project, only 28 of them depicted a female scientist. And all of these 28 depiction of female scientists came from girls, students who were girls. And not a single boy in the study drew a female scientist. And when they sort of fast forwarded it to 2018, um, they show us that the depiction of female scientists grew to about 33% in their projection, and a major shift. This was a major shift from what was depicted as 1% in 1960s. So if you look at this image that was drawn by a fourth grade student, draw a scientist and a fifth grade student, you will see some sort of a similarity between the two hand drawn drawings that you see here. But if you sort of go to the AI version, and when the AI is sort of prompted to draw a scientist, what you see is, absolutely different from, how the children sort of projected, the scientist. And, so this is a composite of AI generated images when asked to draw a photorealistic scientists. And even when they were asked to draw, AI generated images to draw photorealistic engineers. And, this is the pattern of images that the AI sort of, produced, heavily male. And there is sort of not much variation in terms of intersectionalities. So, this also brings us back to questions of data discrimination, algorithmic bias, questions around algorithmic bias. That data discrimination is a real problem, that when the algorithm is drawing from these billions of images, what are these billions of images comprising of, will only get reflected what the algorithm is going to produce. So we have to be really mindful of how we sort of build our databases, build our data, and is that data, a representative data? Is the question that we have to ask ourselves. And this takes us back to this book by Safia Noble, that is titled "Algorithms of Oppression: How Search Engines Reinforce Racism." Again taking us back to questions of algorithmic bias, of algorithmic sort of distortions that sort of produce the results that are heavily stereotyped. In fact, staying on the questions of ethics, last year, the IEEE, the Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers, which is a global body, they sort of, came forth with a diversity inclusion statement that they would ban the usage of Lena's photos in any of their, papers or published, articles, or so, if you know the history of using the Lena, the quote unquote Lena image in computer science, so Lena Forsen was, or is a Swedish model, and her, the image of her face looking over her shoulder backwards has been a very popular image in computer science journals, book covers, and other technological sort of areas that look at questions of image processing, questions of scanning, and so on and so forth from a technological point of view. And this has been there for for a good 50 years or more. And finally, in last year, 2024, the IEEE sort of puts forward this statement that the IEEE's diversity statement and supporting policies such as the IEEE Code of Ethics speak to IEEE's commitment to promoting an inclusive and equitable culture that welcomes all. In alignment with this culture and with respect to the wishes of the subject of the image, Lena Forsen, IEEE will no longer accept submitted papers which include the Lena image. And this is, a very significant moment in the journey of images, using images, and questions of ethics, questions of disparities in digital spaces as it intersects with questions of technology, artificial intelligence, and so on and so forth. It's an interesting article. You may go and take a look at this. Letting go of Lena, the face that launched billions of JPEGs, is finally getting a rest. And this is in the magazine of Society of Women Engineers. So, coming to the question of the future of power, the future of AI, and where are we heading to in keeping in mind social questions, keeping in mind societies at large. This is an interesting article that was published in the Hindu, and the title of the article is. If there is a theory of AI, computer science is unlikely to provide it. And the writer writes that if ever we discover a theory of AI, it is more likely to emerge from discipline of philosophy than from computer science. And this sort of takes us back to the larger and expansive discussions we've had in this course about the journey of computational thinking with regard to techne and phronesis. That while we look at techne, while we look at the technological know-how, we often sort of not look at the phronesis. We sort of, keep phronesis in the blind spot, and tend to overlook questions of wisdom, overlook questions of, the larger inequalities that technique can produce. So that is, bringing into our question of knowledge production, what we understand knowledge production to be, what we understand power negotiations to be, and the relationships, that are sort of orchestrated between knowledge production and power negotiation. So, talking about the questions of knowledge production, it is important for us to look at questions of knowledge representation, and the questions of ontology. So, what is knowledge representation? In common parlance, it's a set of ideas about how to organize information in ways that facilitate recommended inferences, a language in which we say things about the world. And how we represent that knowledge matters, because that sort of builds our connections, how we interpret that knowledge, whether it's in a physical space or in a digital space. So the questions of ontologies, the questions of this interconnectedness, sort of are linked with the question of knowledge representation. And the idea of knowledge representation has evolved over the past decades, hand in hand also with understanding of the versions of the World Wide Web. So how we understand the Web 1.0 to Web 2.0 to 3.0 to 4.0 to 5.0, that is the journey from a static web, to a more social web, to a more semantic web, to a more intelligent web, and the current being the more immersive web. So the journey of the World Wide Web and its various versions sort of give us the versions of knowledge representation, and also, the versions of the syntactic web. And what is the syntactic web? It deals with questions of data integration, data, interoperability, and data linking. So, syntactic web can be in the form of a digital library, can be in the form of a database, a platform or a multimedia, a place where computers do the presentations, and people who are working behind the scene are doing the linking and the interpretation. And that is very important for us to understand, because the training that people receive in doing that work, in doing that linking and interpretation, sort of has a direct influence on how we interpret data. So, on that note, I want to conclude with talking a little bit about the nature of data, as we see changing in the social sciences, and how do we need to be mindful about that changing nature of data when we think of technology, particularly immersive AI sort of questions. And so, we need to think of that, that journey from the classic to more contemporary understanding of, theories, social science theories, that contribute to a more meaningful understanding of the digital age. For example, how do we understand concepts of place and space? How do we understand social inequalities? How do we understand the labor economy and production, for example? How do we understand digital politics and power? And how has the sort of theoretical foundation evolved in response to the digital, or the digitization of societies? That is one area we need to look at. The second area that we need to reflect on is the changing nature of the data, in the sense that we are in the day and age of big data. Talking about the large, not just large corpus of quantitative, numbers, but also how that data is sort of interlinked. And then with that, we need to bring in an understanding of thick big data, which is something I've covered in my methods module. That it's not enough to understand big data as big data, but also to bring in the thickness, the ethnographic account of that big data, and how can we make more meaningful interpretation of big data through the thickness, and then. How do we finally employ doing that sort of research in the digital age? So, what are some of these frameworks that we need to bring in to identify and understand concepts of datafication, of understanding historical archival methods, and how have the practices sort of evolved in the digital age? So, with this, I come to a conclusion of this course, Technology and Society. I hope you have enjoyed this journey of understanding, the various ramifications of technology embedded in a given society, and that technology is a social product, and does have, impacts and influences on the societies that we live in, and vice versa. So it's a two-way process that we look at. So in this course, we have started with the a brief history of society, technology, and social change. And then we have looked at some of the frameworks, theoretical foundations of digital society, to looking at reconceptualizing social research, and through talking about big data and thick data, and then looking at larger ethical implications through questions of identities and inequalities in digital spaces. We looked at questions of algorithms, search engines, social media, AI, and society. To looking at new medical technologies, looking at reproductive technologies, looking at digital public engagements, and then finally, looking at questions of technology, artificial intelligence, and the future of power in society. I hope you have enjoyed this journey and you have taken some learning with you, and more importantly, you will be able to reflect on these larger questions, when you encounter questions of technology and society in your life, career, and beyond. Thank you very much.